Hey, it's a French student here, and this is the first video in a series about SQL with PostgreSQL, where I will be showcasing how to create your first table and insert it into our database. So previously, I have created some videos of how to get PostgreSQL installed, how to set up with pgadmin, and an introduction to relational databases. All links in the description. But the table we're going to be creating today is this user table, which is going to be containing a user ID, a name, an age value created on, and a last login. So firstly, how we're going to be creating anything inside pgadmin is we're going to click on a given database. And let's first have a look inside schemes, tables, and this is empty database. Click on the database, click on query tool, which allows us to write some SQL. So how we're going to create a database table is going to be by doing create table, and I'm going to have the table name, which I'm going to call user table. And sometimes, for example, if I just wrote user, it wouldn't work because user is actually like a keyword inside SQL. So it would get confused. I'm just going to call it user table. We're going to use parentheses. And we're always going to end with a semicolon. But inside, we're going to create our rows, or in this case, our attributes first. And then later on in the next video series, we're going to be inserting data to our table. But first, let's create the first attribute. So the first attribute is going to be our ID. So we're going to have a user ID. Then we're going to have the type. So what kind of type it is. So if you're familiar with most programming language, we have like a integer, double, boolean, and so on. And we kind of have similar, but they're a bit different in SQL. But first for the user ID, we're going to use something called a serial, which is a kind of like an integer that's incrementing by 1. So when we're creating our first user, it's going to have user ID number 1. When we create the second one, it's going to have user ID number 2. So it's automatically creating values. And the reason why we're using a serial is because we're going to use our user ID as our primary key, which means it needs to be unique because it's a unique identifier for a given user. So we give it a primary key, which means forces it needs to be unique. And we can later on in the next video where we're going to be talking about multiple tables and how to connect them, we can connect the other ones by saying this value is similar to our user ID. But that's the next video. For now, we're just going to create a user ID. Just note it's serial incrementing by 1, and it's a primary key, which it means it's unique, and it's the variable we're going to use to identify the specific user. Then we had a name variable, which is gonna be a var char, variable char, which means it's kind of like a string that can contain both numbers or any kind of different symbols. And we're gonna set a specific max size. So it's gonna be max size 250. So it can be between 0 and 250 characters. And we're gonna tell it it's gonna be not null. So we need to have a value. You can't just leave it empty. Again, we're going to have the age, which we're just going to call an integer. If I could spell. There we go. So just a number value. And we just as well going to put it not null. So we would highly prefer often to have the values be not null, which means they need to be filled out unless it actually makes sense for a system to have a null value. Which one I give an example. I'm going to give an example shortly, but then we need our created on and last login. So our created on is going to be of the value timestamp, which as the name suggests is a timestamp value. And it's also going to be not null. And if you might have noticed, I try my best to make all the keywords inside SQL capital letters. It's not something you need to do for it to work, but it's like pretty good practice because it makes it quite a bit easier to actually read what is SQL and what is like variable names. So created on, and we had a last login. And what's special about a last login, at least in this case, is that a last login is whenever the user last logged in. But you actually don't need to have a last login, because maybe you just created an account, but you actually never logged in. So now we have our user table. I would mark all the area and I would press execute. And as you can see, we create table. And now if we right click on a database and click refresh, we can now see under tables, we have a user table which contains some columns. And what's actually can be a bit confusing about like SQL and databases in general at first is that we can't really see a database. We can get information from a database, which we're going to be using later, but I'm going to show a small example. So we can do select from, or we're going to select, which means like select from one specific table. And then we're going to go star, which means select all from user table. And when we run this, we get in our little data output window down here. We can actually see we created a table. It's a user ID, primary key of a serial, which is also integer, name, character varying, varchar, age integer, created on, timestamp, no specified time zone, and last login as well. And then in the next few videos, I'll be showing how to connect our different tables and how to insert data into our tables. So this is the basic introduction of how to create a specific table like this inside a PostgreSQL database using our PG admin tool. So if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe, and I wish you all a wonderful